Welcome to these conversations. As
Thanks
I
so
was
much.
saying, it's the last one of season 5. You're my 84th interview over the last 5 years, which is
Wow,
pretty cool.
phenomenal. Congratulations.
Yeah, I'm Jessica DeWitt, one of the editors here at the network in Canadian History and Environment. And today I am lucky to be joined by Arn Keeling. Can you tell us about yourself?
Sure can. I'm a geographer and I work at Memorial University of Newfoundland in the Department of Geography.
Mm-hmm.
Most of my work, I'm a settler scholar, and most of my work has sort of addressed both the historical and contemporary encounters of Indigenous peoples and some settler communities with large-scale resource development, particularly mining,
Mm-hmm.
mostly in the Canadian North, by which I define the northern portions of the provinces as well as the Northern Territories.
Cool. Yeah, so today I invited you to talk about a special special issue of the Journal of Political Ecology that you recently co-edited on Indigenous voices, self-determination in mine site transitions, and mine closure governance across nations. So that's what we're going to be chatting a bit about today.
Yeah.
And I thought that we could just start off by talking about like the basics. What are you talking about when we're talking about mine site transition, remediation, and reclamation?
Sure. Obviously people associate mining with many of the large scale landscape transformations
Mm-hmm.
we can think of, whether they're head frames or open pits and all of those kinds of dramatic changes, that environmental impacts that we see associated with mining. But of course, the interesting thing about mining is that it is an inherently unsustainable activity in the sense that it is always dealing with a finite resource. Now, it's also true that most mines close not because they run out of ore or run out of valuable materials to dig out of the ground, but usually because of market conditions and a bunch of different other forces.
Mm-hmm.
But when we talk about mine closure and mine site transitions, it's really kind of addressing that very distinctive phase of the mining cycle, whereby often regions or towns that are inherently dependent on that resource are suddenly exposed to the rug being pulled out from under them. The often very sudden closure. But even if it's a planned closure, you might have a couple of years of winding down and then the closure of your main or only industry. So that presents a series of challenges for communities. So when we talk about transitions, it's a way of encompassing both the environmental and the socioeconomic aspects of that
Mm-hmm.
end of mining. There's clearly an environmental dimension to this, right? Some of those dramatic landscape transformations I just mentioned are some of the things that historically perhaps might not have gotten addressed properly by the companies or the governments involved in that exploration and exploitation, and so present long-term pollution or other challenges. But these days, it's also, part of the focus of mine closure is the environmental remediation and reclamation of those sites to the extent that that's possible. But mine
Mm-hmm.
site transitions also, of course, deals with the deindustrialization, if you will, of
Yeah.
mining regions. And that's a term that we often associate with heavy industry or places like, steel mills or factories or et cetera. But of course, is just as true and just as much of a process that's experienced in a mining community, which may or
Mm-hmm.
may not have also mineral processing associated with it. Suddenly, lots of people are out of work. Suddenly there's disinvestment in the region. There may be outmigration. There may be all kinds of processes demographically, socially, and economic that essentially are the reverse of the boomtown phenomenon. So it's when we talk about boom and bust, well, here's the bust. And here is where communities and regions can find themselves struggling to stay alive or threatening to become ghost towns. So,
Mm-hmm.
mine site transition, remediation, and reclamation is a way of kind of thinking those three elements all together, which historically have sometimes been really kept separate by, not only scholars, but different people trying to intervene in those processes, whether they be regulators or communities or First Nations or whomever.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that description. And it's making me also think of a couple episodes ago. I had Bruce March, who is
Mm,
working on Lori Lee Oats's Resource Curse project,
yeah.
on to talk about just transition. And I think that these mine science transitions are very closely tied to this idea of just transition and, taking in consideration the economics and the labor and the people behind these things that we want to change in our broader systems.
Yeah.
Um, so for this special issue of Journal of Political Ecology, I wonder if you could talk about how it came about and how ethical collaboration was fostered between the settler academics and the Indigenous contributors.
Yeah, thanks for that question. It was kind of a unique origin in the sense that it sort of came about through research collaborations and just sort of network building with colleagues in Canada, also students working with me, and then folks from Australia who are working on, Australia is also a very significant mining jurisdiction with very similar history of settler colonialism associated with mineral extraction, and
Mm-hmm.
also contemporary politics and dynamics around land rights, the long-term impacts of mining, et cetera, et cetera. So in some conversations with, particularly with Sarah Holcomb, who is a researcher at the University of Queensland, where they have this really wonderful institution called the Centre for Social Responsibility in Mining, they had actually launched what they called a consortium of scholars and partners working on the question of the social aspects of mine closure, which again has historically been kind of not well regulated if dealt with at all,
Yeah.
even if researchers have talked about that boom and bust phenomenon. So we were, in conversation about communities that we were working with, and we had often even heard from community partners themselves in each of our cases, we're curious about what goes on elsewhere. Like, is our
Mm-hmm.
experience, similar? What can we learn from how folks might be addressing this issue or not in their territories? So we came up with this kind of idea of trying to foster these, as it were, community to community relations and discussions. So rather than filtered through research and researchers, it was an opportunity for community members to meet each other, share their stories in the culturally appropriate forms and ways that they like to do, and to yeah, kind of build their knowledge base to address the challenges that they face. Now, we got all excited about this, and COVID came along. So one of our first challenges was, how are we going to do this while also dealing with the travel restrictions, et cetera? And in a way, the fact that the world moved on to Zoom and did a lot more electronic interaction maybe
Mm-hmm.
was a benefit, in the sense we were trying to kind of connect groups across vast distances, not only in Canada, but between Australia, Aotearoa, New Zealand, um, and how could we get these community members together? So what we tried to do was, we had each person who was working with a community partner sort of had some preparatory conversations and developed some ideas, and we thought about how we would like to engage and talk about these things. Then through the University of Queensland, we hosted a 2-day Indigenous Knowledge Exchange Forum, where it was co-facilitated by an Aboriginal woman named Vanessa Elliott in Australia, and it was hosted in Australia. But we tried to do some creative time zone shifting, et cetera, to allow those of us on the other side of the planet to participate, and to do so in a way that was, again, kind of comfortable, not necessarily over-scripted, not especially academic in nature, but more driven by the concerns, experiences, and observations of the community partners themselves. So in doing that, we created a report based on the forum. We worked with community partners to get that all approved, and so that it reflected as near as possible the voices and again, experiences that people exchanged during that forum. And then there was some of the groups, not all of the groups, indicated an interest in, yeah, we would like to maybe see this go even further in terms of like getting these voices and these perspectives out into the research mainstream, where it might be read by researchers, policymakers, and others. So that was the genesis of doing the special issue of the Journal of Political Ecology.
Very good. That sounds like a really interesting model that others could follow in the future for Indigenous and academic collaboration. And I appreciated like taking it all in with the reading the introduction and whatnot. So um, I wonder if we could wrap up. It's a, there's quite a few articles in this special section,
Mhm.
but if there are three main takeaways that people may get from these articles that make up the whole of the special section.
Sure. We review a sort of some of the themes in the introduction, and so people will we made some effort
Mhm.
as the kind of research supporting team to
Yeah.
draw some of those themes out. But I think for me, the three themes that really stood out, and the three things we heard most from participants, again, whether they're from Aotearoa, whether they're from the Pilbara region of New Zealand or of Australia, or whether they're from Nunavik, or whether they're from the Yukon, is the importance of history. And I
Yeah.
think, niche folks will be nodding their heads
Yeah.
furiously at this. But when we talk about mine closure and maybe, or even reclamation and environmental repair, there's sometimes there's a framing of that as kind of, let's fix things, let's just kind of clean things up and make things tidy, and we'll
Mhm.
have all kinds of really wonderful technical solutions to do that. But for First Nations, their association with large scale mining is often closely tied to a really intensified experience of colonialism,
Yes.
um, and including damage to sacred sites, socioeconomic harms and transitions, economic marginalization by industry, infrastructure that disrupted the way of life of people in those communities, etc. And that history matters. It matters to how policymakers, even people who want to do the right thing in terms of repairing and cleaning up the land,
Mhm.
um, that history needs to be reckoned with, acknowledged, and there needs to be a lot of listening and really
Yeah.
patient engagement done. So that was one of the strongest messages, in fact, because it came up over and over again, regardless of whether we were talking about revegetation or something like
Mhm.
that. And again, on that point, I think the second is that remediation itself is, enclosure and remediation are kind of really distinctive phases of the mining cycle. And so that they deserve a particular kind of attention, but they deserve just as much engagement with communities and with Indigenous knowledge, and with local priorities as a proposed mine. Um, for instance, most you wouldn't necessarily think of mine closure going through environmental assessment, but in a sense, that kind of needs to happen again in a way that offers the public, and in particular rights holders like Indigenous peoples, opportunities to ensure that their priorities, their vision for the future of the land, and their benefit
Mhm.
for what is oftentimes itself a kind of mini boom project. Remediation projects can cost millions, if not billions of dollars, in the case of some abandoned mines.
Yeah.
So how do we ensure that the benefits and the participation, and the opportunities are equally or appropriately shared, I should say, rather than repeating the same mistakes that often the historical development did, of economically marginalizing and not going through processes of free, prior, and informed consent, etc. So remediation, it sounds great. We're healing the land, we're trying to clean things up, but it is vitally important that people's rights be acknowledged. And that kind of brings me to the third element, which is that sovereignty and self-determination are just at the core of these
Mhm.
relations. Whether, again, the kind of language that we're seeing around the proposed mines these days, although we see renewed controversy around how that's being enacted. But that lens also needs to be applied to mine closure. For instance, how can land be rematriated to its original owners might be one of the questions that comes out of mine closure and remediation.
Yeah.
How can we ensure that the stewardship of the peoples whose land this has always been is restored? Who better than to take care of these sites and ensure their environmental integrity than the people whose land and who are most closely tied to it? Now, that doesn't mean you should hang people out to dry and make them responsible for, permanently toxic sites, etc. They have to be properly resourced and
Yeah.
empowered to do that. But by putting that sovereignty and self-determination at the center of that discussion, you might get different kinds of outcomes that actually have better environmental outcomes, as well as not reproducing harm human rights violations, et cetera, et cetera. So those would be the kind of the three. As you can see, they're sort of interconnected. It's
Yeah.
about the history, it's about remediation and repair as a process, and it's about centering the communities and their stewardship and their sovereignty and their territories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As you're talking, I had Peter Fortner on the last episode, and we were talking
Mm-hmm.
about the oil sands and
Yeah,
the impact of the oil sands on the Athabasca River and the communities that reside on it. And he was emphasizing the need for truth. And like before
yeah,
anything can move forward, you actually have to acknowledge the actual history that has happened in that region. And as you're talking about these other mining sites, and this importance of history, it's kind of tied to this idea of truth. Like we need to like acknowledge what has happened
yeah,
before we can even just move forward with these other processes, right? And move to a better future, hopefully. um Anyways, those two conversations are really playing well together in my head.
yeah.
um yeah, so this special section, I know the introduction, and I read two of the articles. They seem to open access. Are
Mhm.
they all open access?
Yeah, they're
Okay.
all open access. That's one of the reasons we approached the Journal of Political Ecology to host this. Um, for a couple of reasons. One, the journal is open access, so that ensures, accessibility for community members and community partners. It also is a journal that was really open to having, in a way, non-traditional scholarship be represented, right? So some of
Mhm.
these are Indigenous solo authored, some of them are
Yep.
co-authored, some of them are kind of like the one that I was involved with, semi-collectively authored.
Mhm.
So we wanted, the space to be able to have people express themselves in manner that is comfortable for them, right? So some of it will read like traditional scholarly work, some of it will read more like storytelling, and some of it will read like activism. It's got a real range of materials there, and I think that's it's a testament to the ways in which the journal made itself open to that, but also to the kind of range of different kinds of partnerships that folks have with their community partners. So
Mhm.
worked a lot. We worked with the third party I really want to give a shout out to here is Rebecca Hall, in global development study at Queen's Universities, who was partnered with NiCHE. And, hers was an example of very close work with a steering committee, but ultimately with the voice of a key knowledge holder, John Bizot, who is the author there. Whereas I was working, a kind of unique situation for me is I've been working in collaboration with Inuit communities doing mine closure planning at an active mine. So we're actually sitting down with company folks and with community members and trying to facilitate that discussion for a mine that's not projected to close for at least 20 more years.
That's
So
interesting.
it was actually that collective group that really took main responsibility. I did a lot of the writing, but we
Yeah.
worked through the whole process of what we wanted to say together. So each little partnership looked different. We were only sad that the folks from Aotearoa decided that they didn't have the capacity to engage with the special issue. But the Indigenous Forum report itself is available online as well. If people would like to see a kind of very unvarnished and almost verbatim version of what the discussions were.
Yeah.
And it's available through a journal called Research Directions, Mine Closure and Transitions, which is an unfortunately short-lived journal project that was through Cambridge University Press, also open access,
Mhm.
which was offering a platform for things like community reports, which kind of was a really unique platform. So if people search for that journal, it's Research Directions, Mine Closure and Transitions, they'll
Okay.
find the report there. And yeah, so that's that. There's two ways of kind of getting at some of the things that were said and some of the different ways in which they were presented.
Wow. Well, thank you for joining me today to talk about this, Arn. This was interesting, enlightening. As I said, I've read the intro and two of the articles so far, and I'm looking forward to delving further into the special section. And yeah, thank you for joining me today. It's great.
My pleasure, and thanks to NiCHE as always for the interest and support.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay,
Take care. Talk another
take care.
day.
You too. All right, bye
Bye.
bye.